In the spring of 1940, France appeared to be Europe's greatest fortress. With over 5 million soldiers under arms and the mighty Maginot Line stretching along the German border, French generals believed they had created an impenetrable defense. These concrete fortifications were engineering marvels, underground cities complete with hospitals, kitchens, and command centers, named after War Minister André Maginot. The French military doctrine emphasized defensive warfare and slow, methodical advances. Generals who had won the Great War in the trenches assumed that any German attack would come directly through their heavily fortified frontier, just as it had in 1914. The Maginot Line embodied this thinking perfectly, a chain of steel and concrete that seemed to guarantee France's security. But there was one fatal flaw in this grand strategy. The fortifications didn't extend along France's border with Belgium. French strategists believed the dense Ardennes forest was impassable to large military formations. They were about to discover how wrong they could be. While France prepared for yesterday's war, Germany was creating tomorrow's. Under innovative generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, the German military had developed Blitzkrieg, lightning war. This wasn't simply about having better tanks or aircraft. It represented a fundamental reimagining of combat itself. Traditional warfare moved slowly and methodically, with careful coordination between separate military branches. Blitzkrieg combined concentrated firepower, rapid movement, and psychological shock to overwhelm enemies before they could react. German forces would punch through enemy lines at a single point, then race deep into enemy territory, spreading chaos and confusion. The Germans possessed approximately 2,400 tanks and had integrated their armor with motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support from Stuka dive bombers. German radio communications allowed unprecedented coordination between units, creating tactical flexibility that their enemies couldn't match. Most importantly, German commanders were fighting the next war while their enemies remained trapped in the strategies of the last one. On May 10, 1940, at 5:35 in the morning, the illusion of the phony war shattered forever. German forces launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, a massive coordinated assault across a 175-mile front stretching from the North Sea to the Maginot Line. The attack began with spectacular deception. German paratroopers seized key Belgian fortresses, including the supposedly impregnable Fort Ebene-Mail, using revolutionary tactics and shaped charges. Glider-borne troops landed directly on fortress roofs, blasting through concrete and steel with explosive devices that defenders had never seen before. As Belgian and Dutch defenses crumbled under this unprecedented assault, French and British forces rushed northward to meet what appeared to be the main German thrust. Millions of Allied soldiers moved toward Belgium, exactly as German planners had hoped. The northern offensive was a massive feint, a carefully orchestrated diversion designed to draw Allied mobile reserves away from Germany's real target. While the world's attention focused on the dramatic battles in Belgium and Holland, the true danger was quietly emerging from an unexpected direction. The Ardennes forest had been dismissed by French military leaders as impassable to large armored formations. This dense woodland between France, Belgium, and Luxembourg seemed like nature's own fortress wall. French intelligence calculated that it would take German forces at least 9 days to move significant numbers of tanks through the narrow, winding forest roads. They were catastrophically wrong by more than a week. On May 13, just 3 days after the offensive began, 7 German armored divisions emerged from the Ardennes like a steel avalanche. Guderian's 19 Corps had accomplished what French planners believed impossible, moving massive formations through terrain that was supposed to provide natural protection. The narrow roads were jammed with German vehicles stretching back for miles, what should have been a perfect target for air attack. But French aviation was already in chaos. The Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority through coordinated strikes on airfields and communication centers. French pilots, flying outdated aircraft, found themselves overwhelmed by German Messerschmitt fighters and the terrifying screams of diving Stukas. The fate of France was decided at Sedan, a town that held bitter memories from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Here, the Meuse River represented France's last natural barrier before the heartland lay completely open to German armor. French defenders, primarily reserve divisions composed of older soldiers with limited training, suddenly found themselves facing Germany's elite armored spearheads. The contrast was devastating. While French troops huddled in outdated fortifications designed for the previous war, German combined arms tactics coordinated tanks, artillery, and air power with lethal precision. On the afternoon of May 13, after hours of bombardment by screaming Stuka dive bombers, German forces established bridgeheads across the Meuse. French counterattacks were piecemeal and poorly coordinated. Communication networks, designed for static warfare, broke down completely under the speed and violence of the German assault. By May 14, German armor was pouring across hastily constructed bridges, racing westward into open French countryside. The front had not merely been breached, it had been obliterated. What followed next would shock the world. German armored spearheads, led by commanders like Rommel and Guderian, raced across northern France in a sweeping arc toward the English Channel. They covered distances in days that would have taken weeks in previous conflicts. French commanders, trained in methodical warfare, found themselves completely outpaced by the German advance. Orders took hours to reach French units that had already been overrun or were rapidly retreating. The entire French command structure, built around careful planning and deliberate movement, collapsed under the weight of German speed and aggression. Refugee columns clogged the roads, adding to the chaos and preventing effective military movement. On May 20th, just 10 days after the offensive began, German tanks reached the coast at Abbeville. The impossible had happened. In less than 2 weeks, German forces had achieved what their predecessors in World War I had failed to accomplish in 4 years of bloody trench warfare. The Allied forces in Belgium and northern France, including the cream of the French army and the entire British Expeditionary Force, were cut off in a massive pocket. With Allied forces trapped in northern France, the situation appeared hopeless. German armor had reached the Channel ports, cutting off escape routes for over 400,000 British, French, and Belgian troops compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around the port of Dunkirk. What followed became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Beginning on May 26, Operation Dynamo launched a desperate evacuation effort using every available vessel, naval destroyers, civilian fishing boats, pleasure craft, and ferry steamers. For 9 days, this improvised armada shuttled back and forth across the English Channel under constant German air attack. Against all expectations, over 300,000 Allied troops were rescued from the beaches. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance, but he was quick to remind the world that wars are not won by evacuations. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped, but left behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, and artillery on the beaches of France. Meanwhile, German forces consolidated their stunning victory in the north and prepared for the final phase of their campaign against the remaining French armies. On June 5, German forces launched Fall Rot, Case Red, the second phase of their campaign against the remaining French armies south of the Somme River. With their best units already destroyed or captured in the north, France faced this new assault with demoralized and undermanned forces. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, pockets of French resistance fought with desperate courage. At the Battle of the Aisne, French forces held their ground for several days against overwhelming odds. But these individual acts of heroism could not overcome the strategic reality. France's military backbone had been shattered. Millions of French civilians fled southward in massive refugee columns, creating scenes of biblical exodus that clogged the very roads French forces needed for military movement. Luftwaffe fighters strafed these helpless columns, spreading terror and chaos. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the military collapse itself. On June 10, the French government abandoned Paris, declaring it an open city to prevent its destruction. That same day, Mussolini's Italy entered the war, launching an invasion of southern France. Despite their overwhelming advantage, Italian forces achieved virtually nothing against determined French Alpine defenders, who held their mountain positions with remarkable tenacity. By June 14, German troops were marching down the Champs-Élysées. The City of Light, symbol of European civilization and culture, had fallen without a shot being fired in its defense. With Paris occupied and German forces advancing rapidly toward the south, the French government faced an impossible choice. On June 16, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun and savior of France in World War I, became prime minister after Paul Reynaud's government collapsed under the weight of military catastrophe. Pétain immediately sought an armistice with Germany, believing that further resistance would only bring more suffering to the French people. For many French citizens, the Marshal's decision seemed like the only rational choice in the face of complete military defeat. On June 22, 1940, in a railway car parked in the forest of Compiègne, the exact location where Germany had surrendered to end World War I, France signed terms that carved up their nation. Hitler had specifically chosen this location and even the same railway car to maximize the humiliation of French defeat. Under the armistice terms, Germany would directly occupy northern and western France, including Paris and the entire Atlantic coast with its vital ports. A new French government under Pétain would administer the southern free zone from the resort town of Vichy. France would pay enormous occupation costs and provide forced labor to Germany. The French fleet would be neutralized, and French prisoners of war would remain in German camps. But even in France's darkest hour, the seeds of future liberation were already being planted. 2 days before the armistice was signed, on June 18, from a BBC studio in London, a relatively unknown 49-year-old general named Charles de Gaulle delivered a broadcast that would echo through history. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. De Gaulle's defiant words reached relatively few French ears that day, but they marked the beginning of Free France and the resistance movements that would eventually contribute to their homeland's liberation. While Marshal Pétain chose the path of accommodation with Germany, de Gaulle chose the path of continued struggle, no matter how hopeless it seemed. The fall of France was complete, but the French spirit of resistance had been born. In just 6 weeks, the balance of power in Europe had shifted dramatically, but the story of France's fight for freedom was far from over. It would continue in the shadows, in the mountains, and in exile, until that glorious day 4 years later when French soldiers would once again march triumphantly through the streets of Paris. The fall of France sent shockwaves around the world. Britain now stood alone against the Nazi war machine. In America, France's collapse accelerated rearmament and moved public opinion toward supporting Britain. Most significantly, France's defeat opened the door to Hitler's ultimate goal, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In just 46 days, one of the world's great military powers had been defeated and occupied. The campaign demonstrated that in modern warfare, innovation and tactical flexibility could triumph over traditional strength and static fortifications. France would indeed rise again, but the Europe that emerged from World War II was forever transformed from the one that existed before those fateful weeks in the spring of 1940.